Well, good evening and a very warm welcome to this seminar in the Global Southeast Europe Seminar Series, convened by Othon, who's sitting right there in the front, convening it. Right, we've got three expert speakers this evening and fascinating subject matter. As always, there will be a problem with time, so I'm afraid that the speakers only have 20 minutes each, and then that leaves us time for a bit of Q&A and sort of delve into some of the subjects. Three speakers, I'll introduce them individually. It's just been agreed, late change, that Konstantinos will speak first, because he's already at the machine, so we're all ready to go. Dr. Konstantinos Filis is Research Director, Institute of International Relations, Panteion University in Athens, specialist in Russian and former Soviet space affairs, economy, energy, geopolitics, and also a strategic planning expert on Greek foreign policy in the broader area of the Black Sea, Caucasus, Central Asia. He's a member of this college, I'm delighted to say, so he's coming back, as indeed is Androulla, to former fields, and we're delighted to see him back. And I'm intrigued to notice that he has provided analysis to the office of the President of Uzbekistan. So if you have a chance to tell us what you told him, we'd be delighted. Konstantinos, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. As I'm addressing you before two very interesting speakers, and because our dialogue is of greater value, I will try to be brief. I will set out in broad lines the trends prevailing at this time in the European gas market and how Russian-EU relations are evolving in the wake of the Ukraine crisis. And after a brief pass over Southeast Europe, I will refer to Greece's position. The European natural gas market. A significant fall in demand for natural gas has been observed for late in Europe, down by 15% as compared to 2010. This is due to the economic slowdown, as well as to a specific shift on the part of European industry towards the use of cheaper fuels, including lignite and coal. As a result, the market appears to be overcontracted at this time, with more contracts being revised at lower prices. Also, contributing in this direction is the dramatic reduction we have seen in LNG prices, due mainly to limited demand from Japan and greater supply to the market from the Oceania region. Right now, the price of LNG for mature European markets, due to the glut in supply, is at about the level of pipeline gas. It is worth noting here that Russia has been obliged to increase market indexation to as much as 60 to 70% in Europe, which means that provided the market price is set in relation to LNG prices, the corresponding Russian price is impacted in favor of the customer. Beyond that, the shale revolution in the US is creating additional prospects for the European market. The first quantities have already been contracted for import into Europe in 2016, with the aim of weakening Russia correspondingly, and despite Asia's being a more profitable destination. But these quantities are not expected to dramatically alter the facts with regard to Europe's energy security. The quantities made available, at least initially, will be on the order of 20 billion cubic meters annually. That is about 4% of total European consumption. At the same time, two serious concerns arise. On the one hand, the looming low competitiveness in the pricing of American shale gas due to a lack of infrastructure in Europe and the need to develop new export facilities in the US, as well as the effect that low oil prices will have on the development of new fields, given that the break-even for shale is about $60 to $70 per barrel. Meanwhile, there are several other initiatives that are seen as potentially contributing to the EU security of supply and are therefore of equal priority for the EU. These are the interconnectivity of European networks, the improvement and development of infrastructure and reverse flow routes, the expansion of storage facilities, and energy saving, energy conservation. Of late, greater emphasis is also been put on domestic production of hydrocarbons in regions such as the Black Sea, mainly in Romania, and the Adriatic and the Eastern Mediterranean. This also includes the further development of renewable energy sources, but the viability of this development model is seen as doubtful under the current conditions, ultimately depending on the end cost. We can't rule out a temporary lapse of interest due to low demand and lower import prices, though this in no way guarantees energy independence, as we will see further on. In parallel, the EU is stepping up its efforts to increase diversification as a means for ensuring greater security of supply. The midterm political goal is the expansion of the Southern Corridor and the importing of some 10% of European demand from the Caspian region and later the Middle East. However, some of these states seem, to a great extent, to be leaning towards the East and not towards Europe, with ever closer ties and cooperation. And in any case, even if synergies are achieved with the Caspian, it clearly won't suffice to fundamentally offset the loss of Russian imports. The TAPS, that is the Trans-Adriatic Pipeline, it is a project that will deliver Azeri natural gas through Turkey, Greece and Albania to Italy. It has a capacity of 10 BCM, that is 10 billion cubic meters, and it will flow in around 2020, and it will account for just 2% of annual demand in the EU, although with the development of other resources in Azerbaijan, the TAP will be in a position to transport up to 20 billion cubic meters in the second phase of its development. Still, if we add the quantities that may be available to the EU in 10 to 15 years' time, we have two serious beneficial consequences. First, the achievement of more competitive prices due to multiple choices, having completed the interconnection of the European networks on market index price, and for the less mature markets, like those of Eastern and Southeast Europe, on better terms for a more homogenized European market. And second, the reduction of dependence on Moscow. Dependence is never desirable because it limits one's space for negotiation. So more specifically, with about 20 BCM annually from the Caspian, the same amount from North American shale gas, similar and possibly greater quantities from Iran if it exits its current international isolation, and 10 to 15 BCM from Iraq and the Eastern Mediterranean, we cover about half of the total quantities we receive from Russia. And this is at a time when it doesn't appear that we will have any serious supply gap over the next 2 decades. There is no question that the EU's efforts have already impacted Gazprom's market share. Its total share has fallen from 50% in 2000 to 32% in 2010 and close to 25% in 2012, rising to about 30% in 2013. Nevertheless, Russia is still the European Union's most important energy partner. On the other hand, there are trends that seem catalytically against us, and if we do not intervene quickly, we are likely once again to miss the boat. For example, it is estimated that by 2035, natural gas imports will increase from 66 to 84%. By 2035, hydrocarbon production in the EU will have fallen by 57% in oil, 49% in coal, and 46% in natural gas. In parallel, the shift of global energy demand center of gravity towards emerging economies of the East is tipping the scales dramatically. As time goes by, it is becoming even more evident that Europe is facing intensifying competition and rising mineral resource prices, not only from emerging economies, but also from energy-producing countries like those in the Middle East. Thus, given its excessive dependency, the EU is likely to become more vulnerable to supply-related risks. Getting to EU-Russian relations, these are seen as being for the most part complementary and interdependent. And this is because the EU is the largest foreign market for Russia's energy products. It is a premium market that pays well and on time for a state that is so much dependent on energy exports. In fact, it is worth noting that up until a few years ago, when Russia was forced to adapt its pricing downwards for the needs of Europe in recession, Gazprom set prices on top of cost and the investments it had made, having long amortized those investments and essentially subsidizing the exports of cheap gas that had been secured by former Soviet republics. Thus, the EU and the Kremlin are very clearly interdependent energy partners. But there are elements of concern. One of the most important is that the apparent interdependence is not equally balanced. 13 European countries rely on Russia for over 80% of their total consumption of natural gas. And 17 European member states are dependent on Russia for over 80% of the natural gas imports. Thus, from this point of view, the relationship is one of dependence of one party rather than independence. Unfortunately, most Southeast European countries belong to this category. Moreover, the lopsided relationship is exacerbated by the fact that about half of the Russian natural gas that entered the EU in 2013 did so via Ukraine, an amount that comes to about 15% of total European consumption. The doubts as to Moscow's reliability as an energy supplier, which arose in 2006 and 2009, further complicated Russian-European relations. The current crisis with Ukraine has increased tensions that are the result of this dependency. Gazprom's development of the Nord Stream and recently the Turkish Stream, which would replace South Stream, hasn't quelled that reservations of Brussels, which sees the two pipelines as being part of the Russian strategy for consolidating its market share. And a number of countries perceive these moves as the means to achieving dependable supply. According to the initial plan, Moscow through South Stream and now through Turkish Stream would supply the Central and Southeast European markets with additional quantities on the order of 63 BCM. With a Nabucco project frozen indefinitely, if South Stream had moved ahead, Gazprom's position would have been strengthened perceptibly, simultaneously weakening Ukraine's transit role, in which, as Europe, we are in fact investing, both politically and economically. If in the future the Black Sea offshore pipeline operates at full capacity, that is 63 BCM, then Kiev will either be further sidelined, removing a serious thorn from the Kremlin side and sticking it into Europe's, or its role will cease to exist altogether, and these quantities correspond to those transiting Ukrainian territory. Here I just need to make a clarification. We're not talking about new quantities coming from Russia. We are talking about the quantities that are now being transported through Ukraine to find another way to be transported to feed the European market. However, given the Europe-wide fall in demand, the Commission's unwillingness to support a Russian interest pipeline, Moscow's financial difficulties, which impact the potential for funding what is in any case a costly project, I mean South Stream, economies of scale and the need for general rationalization, it seems unlikely at this time that the Turkish Stream will make up for the South Stream in terms of quantities. A more realistic scenario is for it to be used to provide 12 to 14 BCM to the Turkish market, while also providing similar quantities subtracted or diverted from the Ukrainian network to Europe. At the same time, despite the competitive nature of the Moscow-Ankara relationship, Russia appears to be attempting to neutralize Turkey via the latter's thirst for energy and substantial energy dependency on Russia, as well as give a sense of potential withdrawal from the European market in order to shake up at least those countries that would be hardest hit in such an eventuality. Beyond that, Southeast Europe, which suffers from lack of liberalization and unfortunately is neither interconnected in terms of energy networks, with the rest of Europe, nor mature in terms of markets, is unlikely to achieve a reduction in its dependency on Russia in the short term. This situation has led to consistently higher prices for the region as compared with prices for mature European markets. But following 2018-2019, through new interconnectors and existing and planned LNG terminals, Southeast Europe will have better access to alternative gas supplies and to global markets. Still, if the Russian gas reaches us earlier, the temptation to participate will become greater for more member states and certainly for those who looked forward to the implementation of the South Stream. Unforeseen, within quotes, disruptions in supply flow aimed at pointing up Ukraine as problematic are expected to follow, obliging European states with a greater dependency to create plans for absorbing the Russian gas on our doorstep. Here, we need to identify the different characteristics of each of Europe's geographical regions, as some have very large gas needs and fewer alternatives, which correspondingly determines their stance towards Moscow and other suppliers. This enables Moscow to invest systematically in divide and conquer policy, splitting off European states, which based on national interest determine their own policies. Let's not forget that Germany, ignoring the common European interest, and countries like Poland advocated for the construction of the Nord Stream, which carries Russian gas directly to Germany. It has been shown to be objectively impossible, due to the importance of energy to national economies, to form a united front against Moscow, and this enables the latter to use natural gas as a tool of influence. Turning to Greece, I have 4 minutes.
Yes,
is that correct?
That's super.
Okay. Turning to Greece, 2015 is a year of decisions and clarification of the state of affairs on a number of levels. One such level is the sustaining of the Trans-Adriatic pipeline, to which I referred earlier, momentum, and acceleration of construction at a time when the project is under a great deal of pressure. In spite of the TAPS project maturity, there is still a long way to go before it is completed, and there are obstacles on the path, both domestically, where there are reactions that have not yet been overcome and that may intensify following the elections, with an attempt at partial amendment of the host country agreement being one of the SEESOX, the new government's campaign commitments, and externally with certain delays that put completion back to after 2020, as well as difficulties in obtaining a landfall permit in Italy. These are the three major obstacles or challenges that TAP has to confront. Another matter is our stance, Greece's stance, on the developing transit hub for Russian gas on the Greek-Turkish border, which may impact the implementation of the vertical corridor centered on the interconnector Greece-Bulgaria. I will just show you a map in a while to understand what exactly I'm saying, actually in which projects I am referring. Moscow appears to be determined for a number of reasons to move ahead with replacing the South Stream with an alternative plan, and the extent to which Greece may or is expected to participate in this plan remains unclear. Beyond this, and despite the fact that we need to be open to any proposal that would mean an expanded and positive role on the energy states, always based on a given proposal's viability and its added value for our strategic interests, we need to decide on a strategy in which each choice is complementary to our other choices rather than cancelling them out. However important diversification of suppliers is, the addition of new transport corridors is just as vital. To render systematic our efforts to emerge as a potential critical transit link for the EU security of supply, we need pluralism and relative flexibility in our maneuvers, in combination with the upgrading of existing facilities and construction of new LNG terminal in northern Greece, as well as natural gas storage facilities and the development of gas interconnectors. This will enable us to provide quantities via alternative transport routes to the Eastern Balkans and from there to Europe. Of course, turning Greece into a pipeline crossroads will require joint ventures and attraction of investments, for which a necessary condition is stable interstate relations with and domestic stability in the involved partner countries. Which brings us to the Eastern Mediterranean, where though delays, we have of course Ms. Kaminara who's going to be talking about that, where though delays are expected, procedures and the search for additional sources might be intensified, and this will be decisive in developing the potential for providing gas to third markets. However, this region is lagging behind others in terms of both quantity and timelines, while its prospects hinge to a great extent on the settlement of long-standing disputes, on the course of the reformation of regimes and societies, on the adequate confrontation of regional risks, and on energy prices. In any case, the alliances being promoted need to be substantially deepened if they are to stand the test of time. It is reasonable to expect that any joint ventures embarked upon will not meet with the approval of all of the forces in the region. Ladies and gentlemen, in a globalized environment, Greece is not operating in a vacuum, but in a state of strong uncertainty. Geopolitical instability precludes any complacency or internal divisions. It is the achievement of broad convergences and a united front that will create conditions for more effective interventions and defense of our national energy interests against growing competition. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, you've got us off to a rattling good start. Right, the next of the panelists to speak will be Diana Bozhilova, sitting on my right, who I notice had a very distinguished academic career at both King's and LSE and Inter Alia, other places. She now has positions both at King's and the New College of the Humanities in London. Research interests include Europeanisation in Southeast Europe, in Bulgaria, Greece, Turkey. Also interest in justice and home affairs, industrial policy, public procurement policy, and, you'll be pleased to know, in energy security, which brings us to what she's going to talk about today. And I think, Diana, you're going to talk about general developments in the Balkans, perhaps especially concentrating on Bulgaria and Serbia. And I think you also will say something about the revised South Stream.
Yes,
right.
Definitely.
I've said enough. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to frame it slightly differently because indeed your talk has been wonderful and so exhaustive and put us to a wonderful start. So I'm going to actually try and see the extent to which energy policy can promote convergence. And so I think one of the key objectives of EU integration that is so important to the region of Southeast Europe is both democratic and economic convergence, with the latter being supported by a number of direct policies, such as in particular the regional policy. Energy policy, even if an area of thin key, has an enormous impact on economic convergence, in addition to regional policy as a force strongly underpinning the single market. This is evident from discourses about the key established economic convergence models in this regard, such as neoclassical growth theory, so that essentially we maintain a consistent technological level of development across the EU. Secondly, endogenous growth models, so that we provide consistent flows of funds to regions such as Southeast Europe in order to promote public procurement that can then achieve technological development. And thirdly, new economic geography, which is about the impact of economic agglomeration resulting from regionalism, and which essentially argues that it is other forces that ultimately determine the extent of convergence and divergence. So the EU, in my view, the European Union, addresses neoclassical and endogenous growth theory through its immediate regional policies on economic convergence, such as structural, social and cohesion funds. The evidence would indicate that both neoclassical and endogenous growth theory makes sense even within the context of the fifth enlargement. However, we need to differentiate between the Central European and the Southeast European countries for this to be a valid statement, because in fact we have significant differences between the two, and crucially also in the realm of energy security. The region of Southeast Europe is an outlier in that it displays greater specialization than the Central European countries, especially those neighboring Germany and the Nordic states from amongst the Central Europeans. So therefore economic divergence is more dominant within Southeast Europe, with the region remaining the poorest on the continent since transitions began. Given this, we then need to understand energy securitization in Southeast Europe as part of the contributing effects to both convergence and new economic geography. I tend to see energy policies consistent with, general energy policy consistent with expectations for economic convergence across the EU area, as it is supposed to stimulate growth. However, this outcome is conditioned by the presence of a number of EU-supported or EU-wider projects, such as Nabucco in the first instance, also to some extent Nord Stream and Opal, as well as possibly ITG, but with a much more marginal impact. Since Nabucco has been scrapped or frozen, as you say, for some time now, then within Southeast Europe we cannot expect endogenous growth resulting from EU-wide or EU-supported energy projects. Moreover, no alternative or replacement of Nabucco has been proposed, and so this kind of vacuum, this gap, has been in existence for some time. Therefore, I tend to see energy policy in Southeast Europe in light of the outputs from economic geography, and so that would mean that I anticipate current scenarios in energy policy to lead to greater economic divergence between Southeast Europe and the rest of the European Union. South Stream and TAP are all regional with little or no EU input. Thus, removing EU-backed projects from the region removes alternatives to new economic geography as growth models, and therefore this can be expected to lead to divergence due to specialization. I think this expectation is actually consistent with the evidence from macroeconomic indicators, and additionally, the cancellation of some of the region-wide projects such as South Stream should appear to further reduce endogenous growth opportunities, which may arise as spillovers even from new economic geography theory. Greece's role in Southeast Europe was, for a time, consistent with such expectations. However, the dragged-out crisis in the state, which led to a dramatic loss in GDP, so over 25% over time, now precludes the strategic role of the state for economic convergence in the region. So we don't actually have an anchor, something similar to, let's say, Germany for the Central Europe, with fossil fuels from the Russian Federation. They're over 90% dependent, which is quite different from some of the other states in Southeast Europe. The present capacity to diversify endogenously exists through two avenues, which you mentioned, renewable energy sources and shale gas exploration. However, we have to bear in mind that in Bulgaria the latter is banned. In Serbia it is permitted, but with licensing, which is a precarious process, and it is more freely licensed in the rest of the Western Balkans. Both technologies, regardless of their accessibility, are actually imported, so therefore they're quite costly, and therefore presently lack sustainability and also social licensing. The alternatives in this context are inconsistent with both new classical and endogenous growth economic convergence models, which the EU would otherwise wish to promote. They're dependent on equity accrued via inward foreign direct investment in the main, which since 2009 has been declining to below the critical minimum for converging economies. The technological development of renewable sources of energy is further dependent on large continuous state subsidies. However, the feed-in tariffs have been significantly slashed since 2011, reducing their attractiveness to investors. Given a combination of a weak economic outlook, so in Bulgaria it has been in fact contracting, and in Serbia it has only been modestly rebounding, as well as the political risk associated with these states, owing in large part to corruption and state capture assessments, and strategic investment in alternative energy diversifying technologies is not immediately accessible. Now, if we look to how this sits in with, or how this compares with some of the other states in Southeast Europe, in particular Greece and Romania, so they have actually done more in the case of diversification than Bulgaria and Serbia. So as we've heard in the case of Greece through LNG and some other alternative pipeline routes, and in the case of Romania, that has been significantly supported through shale gas exploration. And that has had a significant impact. So in a way, even if Southeast Europe is an outlier in this discussion, then Bulgaria and Romania are an outlier even within Southeast Europe in that respect. And the need for them to converge, so to catch up with the mean economic development of the rest of the European Union is most prominent because, of course, they are, certainly Bulgaria, the poorest of the EU member states. I wouldn't draw now a picture of kind of the supranational aspect of the discourse on energy in Southeast Europe because that's already been done, and save for re-emphasizing the fact that indeed when we talk about energy dependence in the European Union, then we must differentiate between those states from Central and Eastern Europe that as a result of common legacies are very significantly dependent on Russian imports, fossil fuel imports, and the rest of the European Union, where that dependence is differentiated. So we have greater dependence with Germany and Italy, but much less so, let's say, with France or Spain or the UK, etc., if any, in fact. The EU and Russia are in this interdependent relationship, which was so well analyzed, and in the case of or the aspect of that interdependent relationship that affects Southeast Europe, it really is the pipeline routes via Ukraine. So basically the challenge for the EU in seeking out the formulation of a common stance, both with regards to this geopolitical constellation, i.e. the interdependent nature of relations with Russia, advancing an exemption from the European Commission from the Third Energy Package Directive in order to build OPAL and to operate Nord Stream, and therefore ensure the security of direct energy supply from Russia, irrespective of the situation in its vicinity. And however, the European Commission seems to have advanced the reverse of this argument in order to cease and desist the completion of the South Stream pipeline, which would have provided similar energy security of supply to Southeast Europe. By similar, I really don't reference necessarily the quantities, but specifically bypassing, let's say, any conflict in Ukraine. In essence, this has resulted not only in a normative double standard vis-à-vis Russia, but critically to the present discussion to a de facto double standard towards the states of Southeast Europe, and affecting most perversely Bulgaria and Romania as the key transit countries in this project. Conversely, the most dependent region and within it states in Europe are entitled to least energy security. Whilst the EU would like Russia to ensure security in energy supply, it is itself precluding it from doing so in practice, tying in effect its objective to develop a common supranational foreign policy, intergovernmental as it is at present, to the fossil fuel poverty and general economic underdevelopment of Southeast Europe. The scrapping of South Stream would actually lead, I have read in Bulgarian Foreign Office papers, to the likely scrapping of pre-planned reverse interconnectors that involve Bulgaria and all of the neighboring Southeast European countries, simply because there wouldn't be the funds or, in fact, the capacity to build those. So actually, the fact that there is a poor network and interconnectedness between the states of Southeast Europe will be further exacerbated by the scrapping of South Stream. That is not to say the South Stream is necessarily a good thing. As we heard, actually increasing dependence is never a good thing. The point is, however, that the European Union has not supplanted the scrapping of one project with an alternative. And so therefore, the ideas that should underpin convergence are not there. Now, is there anything to be done? Well, for one thing, the key thing is to prop up inward foreign direct investment in infrastructure, specifically national grid transmission systems, if the alternatives, so the immediate alternatives of renewables, and those viable coalition building exercises should hopefully bring in both more investment and more security in the region. So should hopefully allow for energy to maintain its role of potential growth indicator in those economies. I think that where things stand at the moment, and because of constraints of time, the outlook for Bulgaria and Serbia is relatively gloomy. I think that if they aren't able to bring in investment for the construction of projects, then they would be trapped in at least another decade of a waiting room, which is what they've more or less done so far. Unfortunately, I really don't have the time. We might go into it during discussion, but Bulgaria and Serbia, but Bulgaria very prominently spent the past decade in foregoing a significant amount of opportunities, which Greece, despite the economic turndown, and Romania, despite institutional struggles, have actually done much better at. So.
Diana, thank you very much indeed. Gosh, you speak faster than I can write.
Sorry.
But,
I was trying to cover lots of ground.
Very good. But I see Androulla's got it all down. So right, Androulla, while you move along, I'll just introduce you. Just to say, Androulla is now the principal advisor at EuropeAid with the European Commission. She's had a long and distinguished career with the European Commission in various places, and in between times she had a couple of very distinguished years here at St Antony's as the EU fellow. So we're delighted to have you back, Androulla. And the third of our linked presentations here, Androulla will be covering developments in the Eastern Mediterranean, particularly affecting Turkey, Cyprus, Israel and Egypt. Is that right, Androulla, or have I got that wrong?
Yes, that's correct. I will try and do it within the time limit.
Okay, well, just to say, we're doing very well so far, so thanks to our two speakers so far.
Okay, so, first of all, I'm delighted to be back and to see old friends and to be again in this room for debating more about Southeast Europe, so thank you for the invitation. I will, let's see how this one works. Okay, I will basically try and say a few things about the global energy mega changes, because anything you say about Southeast Europe, in my view, has to be put in context of what's happening globally. Then I would say a few things about the countries that David said, and I would try and answer the question about empowerment or dependency in the end. So let's start about the mega changes. Of course, the top news is the falling price of oil. Anything that's happening in the energy sector is very much influenced by that. We've had a 60% decrease in oil prices since last summer. And recently in Davos, the Goldman Sachs president actually declared that the prices are going to go even further down. When you see the chart, it's quite a steep decline, and I think they're expecting prices of up to or as low as, to be more correct, at $30 per barrel. So anything that's happening on the energy, either interconnection or new projects or new alliances, will have to be taken into consideration in this context. Just one word on in a wider context, all the oil producing countries in the world like Nigeria, Venezuela and of course Russia, which was mentioned before, are having serious problems. The ruble has fallen, the naira has fallen, so huge knock-on effects on the economy of those, both the producers and the developers. You will see a lot of photographs. This is Mr. Putin. Of course, the situation in Russia and the knock-on effect of this on Russia economy has been dramatic. But I would say that one of the most dramatic changes globally is the agreement between Russia and China. We're talking about a deal that is of the order of magnitude of 300 billion euros, 400 billion euros, sorry. And although they were negotiating for about 10 years, as soon as the problems with Europe happened, Russia immediately turned to China and lowered the prices, and there was an immediate agreement. It's tying in Russia and China for the next 30 years. So when we're talking about dependency of European countries on Russian gas supplies, of course that's important, but with this deal, Russia in a way has looked to another region of the world and no longer sort of depends on what Europe does so much. Although Russia is still supplying 1/3 of the gas to Europe. On top of that, there was an agreement recently over that China would support Russia in building a pipeline to the tune of $20 billion. So if we look now, and I will explain why later on why I'm looking at the demand and the supply. If we look at what has been happening over the last few years, here basically you see that oil demand, which is the yellow, is lower than oil supply. So when we're talking about natural gas, that also has an influence. In fact, this type of the oil demand being lower than supply is even being discussed that it may lead to the cancellation of this huge pipeline that has been discussed in the US between Canada and the US, the Keystone pipeline, because of the changing the economics of new infrastructure projects. My co-speakers mentioned the variable geometry between the variable dependency of member states with respect to imports of energy. I would just like to, I don't know if you can make out which country is which. Can you read the countries? Well, I would just point out. Oops. This is Cyprus, so it's almost 100% imports. Greece is here. Bulgaria. So you see a lot of the countries, and this is Turkey. These are the countries waiting to join the EU. So on the right, so Turkey, you see it's almost 100% dependency. So just on the basis of these facts, each country, each member state obviously has different needs, both immediate and long term, and also has a different approach to what should happen on the energy policy within Europe. So with that, just to put it in context, let's see the East Mediterranean. And I will start with Turkey. There's a lot of these handshakes in my presentation because there seems to be a lot of this type of diplomacy. There was a lot of talk, and in fact a lot of people were writing about the possibility that Europe will need and will have to turn to Turkey because of what happened with Ukraine. Of course, Turkey's ambition is to have all the pipelines going through Turkey. And in fact, I was always of the opinion that Turkey depended so much on Russia that by the fact that Turkey depends so much on Russia to cover its own needs, then it's not an alternative for Europe because Turkey is almost tied very closely to Russia. And in fact, what has happened is that despite the totally different position of Turkey and Russia vis-a-vis what's happening in Syria and the rhetoric and everything else, nonetheless there was a deal signed for a 22 billion nuclear energy investment of Russia in Turkey. So we're seeing that Turkey is not only depending on Russia, but it's increasing its dependency on Russia. So that's, I think, something to be underlined. And also the fact that they're going into nuclear together is giving Russia a new sector, which they were not really, they're not really experts in nuclear energy up until now. So if we look at what is Turkey's plans, in a nutshell, Turkey is one of the largest gas consumers in the world. Its current needs are about 50 BCM per year, and they're expected to increase to about 70 BCM by 2020. It's an increase of 40%. So it's not only one of the biggest consumers, but one of the fastest growing consumers. On the other hand, it has one of the cheapest electricities in the EU. Although its objective was the diversification of suppliers, as I've just mentioned, in fact, is getting more and more drawn into tight relations with Russia. In a way, if we wanted in one phrase to say what is Turkey's objective, I would say Turkey has gone from the dogma of zero problems with neighbors to the dogma of energy hub for everybody. If I would to put it in one phrase, that's what they are aiming at, because on the one hand, it would give them a geostrategic power if they are in that position, but secondly, because they want to make sure that they can cover their own needs. There are studies that say in the next couple of years, because of the type of contracts that Turkey has signed, they may be going even into shortages. So they're trying every way possible to use both the geostrategic leverage from that, but also to cover their own needs. A few days ago, in fact, Erdogan said that they need to invest about 120 billion in infrastructure on energy until 2023. 2023, it's in a few years. It's a huge investment that Turkey has to put in place in order to cover its needs. Since we're talking also about energy politics, I found this, which is not related directly to the countries I will be discussing, but this is a map from the New York Times recently, and it talks about Iraq's oil-gas infrastructure and the territories occupied by ISIL. In fact, it has been calculated that they're having an income of $3 million per day, because they've taken over the areas where is the oil, and in fact, rather than the big oil installations, you have very clandestine, small-scale, very unhealthy, but I don't think they're really concerned about that, installations, and they load all of this oil on trucks and they distribute it on with big trucks to neighboring countries. Quite a lot of that is actually ending up in Turkey as well. So before I move to the next country, because I don't know about timing.
You have 7 minutes.
Okay, so I have to go fast. In fact, there's a well-known joke apparently in Israel which said, isn't it ironic that Moses walked through the Middle East for about 40 years and found the only land without oil to settle in? But that is an obsolete joke, because Israel, of course, has found natural gas in its offshore waters. Israel is already exporting, it's already producing gas from the Tamar field, and it was meant to have the Leviathan field on stream by 2017. It is estimated it's saving about 8 billion per year on these from these natural gas finds, and that its gas reserves are worth about 130 billion. It has, however, taken about 2 years to decide if they would export, and in the end they decided they would be exporting up to the level of 40% of its current energy. But recently, and I'm talking the last few weeks, a lot of changes have taken place, And to those of you that speak Greek, that is a Greek, the most common of common fish called yilos. And why is this important in Israel? Because there's a very important man in Israel called Yilo, David Yilo. And for those of you that haven't heard of him, he became very, very famous because he's the head of the antitrust commission in Israel. And recently he took a ruling that the current deal between Noble Energy and Delek basically forms a cartel in Israel. So therefore, they're launching now into a long negotiation process whereby either the two companies have to sell some of their smaller shares in gas fields, or the market will have to somehow change. But this has sent, seismic waves to the whole energy in the area, because on the one hand, it was expected that Israel would be exporting from Leviathan by 2017. It has even signed memorandums of understanding with Egypt, with the Palestinian Authority, with Lebanon, in order to, with Jordan, in order to export. But this decision by Mr. Yilo basically puts the whole deals on the back burner until all the legal uncertainties are actually worked out. And of course, anybody who may be thinking of investing in the region or looking at what are the implications of the discoveries in the region will have to wait and see what happens on this deal in order to take any position. I'm skipping quite a lot of things because I want to cover some other things. Just a note, Israel-Turkey relations. Israel-Turkey relations. Recently, because there's also this geostrategic relations in the area, recently Lieberman, the foreign minister, called Erdogan anti-Semitist, and Erdogan called Netanyahu terrorists like the ones from Charlie Hebdo. So Israel-Turkey relations quite bad. At the same time, Erdogan has been meeting Mr. Abbas quite often. This is the famous photograph from the steps where you have all the different generations of soldiers in their uniforms. But a little note on the Palestinian energy situation. There's a lot of analysts that are saying that the events that happened last summer between Israel and the Palestinians were related to the energy finds, because if the Palestinian Authority is able to export, then that means that a Palestinian state is economically viable, or at least it's helping it to become economically viable. And there has been since 2000 some discoveries of potential discoveries of natural gas in the waters of Gaza, but since then nothing has moved and nothing has been exploited. And I can refer to that if people are more interested. Let's turn to Cyprus, because it would be tragic if I have to skip Cyprus.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about the energy part of Cyprus. The map, you see the plots that Cyprus has already licensed. Basically 6 blocks have been licensed. One is the Noble Energy, Delek, which are the same companies that are taking are doing the exploration in Israel and depend on this Mr. Yilo's decision on the antitrust position. And then you have Total and Eni Kogas. Eni has been drilling, making geological studies in offshore in Cyprus since about last year, the same as Total. But in the meantime, there was a little ship called Barbaros, which is an exploration ship, a Turkish exploration ship, which since October has been going in the Cypriot exclusive economic zone to the great stress, I would say, of the Cypriot government. And as a result of that, in fact, they stopped the negotiations. President Anastasiadis has refused to continue with the negotiations on the Cyprus issue because they're not being respected by Turkey. Most of the time leading up to the end of the year, because Turkey issued a NAVTEX, which is a navigational telex, saying that Barbaros will be in those waters until the 30th of December. And most of the end of the year in Cyprus was, would it leave or would it not leave afterwards, and can the negotiations be resumed? In fact, the NAVTEX has been reissued for this year, but there is now the ship is in port in Famagusta, and there's some attempts to bring the two parties back to the negotiating table. So again, some more handshakes to put it in a more regional context. Over the last couple of years, there have been a lot of coordination or attempts for cooperation with the regional government. This is, on the left is Mr. Maniatis, the ex-Greek Minister of Energy. In the center is the Cypriot Minister of Energy. And to the right is the Israeli Minister of Energy, Mr. Shalom. I could produce another 15 of these photographs with everybody in the region, Egypt, Lebanon. I don't know how many times there were Israelis in Cyprus and Cypriots in Israel. So it's quite clear to all the countries in the region that they need to cooperate. In any case, any of them that need to maximize on profit from the natural gas has to look at its neighbors. It's much more profitable selling to your neighbors than trying to sell somebody who's further afield. But so far, it's mostly memorandums of understanding and intentions, good intentions to cooperate, rather than something concrete. I'll skip that. And another piece of news on Cyprus, as I showed earlier, there were three basic consortia that are in Cyprus, one of them being Total, but Total in the last week has announced that maybe they're leaving Cyprus, so it may be exiting. There's been a lot of negotiations there. It is, I think, one of the reasons that they're considering to do that. It's also influenced by the fact that there are such reduced cost of oil, and this is making some of the long-term investment projects, bringing them to the edge of profitability. So there's a lot of negotiations now with Total, at least to extend the time that they have these concessions, so maybe that they would not leave. But this is one of the knock-on effects of that. I have three more slides. This is a slide that actually 2 years ago I was considering on what could be done with respect to how in fact to address the Cyprus problem without making it more complicated by the fact that there were energy resources. And this is not my idea. This is the idea that I got from talking to Professor Van der Bloem from Oxford, actually. And I said, what would you do if you were Cypriot? And he suggested the Alaskan model, and when I looked into it, I thought it was absolutely brilliant. And in fact, since then, when I wrote things about it, this idea has been translated even into Greek and Turkish, and it has gained momentum in Cyprus. So it's quite simple. What it does is you form a natural gas fund. You don't use the original funds to invest, but you invest the profits of the fund, and then whatever you get, you distribute to everybody exactly the same amount, regardless of whether they're Turkish Cypriot, Greek Cypriots, or any of the other Maronites or Armenians or anything else of the island, and regardless of whether they are children or older people or anything else. So whatever the check, let's say 1,000, everybody on the island who is acknowledged to be a Cypriot, because that's another story that will come out of the negotiations, gets this check. But this has obvious benefits because, first of all, it's fair and easy to understand. So it gets away from the paranoia between the two sides, who gets what and why and where does it go. It's transparent. There's less corruption possibilities because it's the individual that decides what to do with the money they're getting rather than the constituent state or whatever else it may be called coming out of the negotiations. And of course, because each person, each child, each human being on the island gets the same amount, it helps big families, and of course the proportional amount that poor families would get is a bigger part of their budget. So let's say if your family gets 5,000 but their total income in a year is 20, it's a much bigger thing than somebody who earns 100,000. So again, recently the Turkish side has proposed something like this. The only difference being that they want the UN, they want exactly this, but the UN to be the administrator of this fund, which I personally think it's, I cannot imagine that the Greek Cypriots will accept, because that would mean handing over whatever wealth they have. But I believe a solution to this is somewhere along these lines, maybe to find some sort of not so extreme kind of way of doing it, but somewhere in between there could potentially be a solution on this. And one slide on Egypt and I'm finished. Egypt has basically been a major energy exporter until recently. Its needs for energy has been increasing rapidly. It's a country that's been subsidizing its energy. Subsidized for energies have been costing about 6% of GDP. And in fact, Al-Sisi in June last year took away some of the subsidies, with the consequence that the petrol prices rose by 78% overnight. Lucky for him was at the stage that oil prices were being reduced, so there wasn't so much a backlash from the people because of that, because energy prices were already reduced. The role of Egypt vis-à-vis Israel is also very important, because Egypt was exporting until recently, until Morsi came to power, was exporting gas to Israel. And a year ago, the terms of this contract became known, and in fact Egypt was giving natural gas to Israel about 1/4 of the price, in a way subsidizing the energy bill of Israel. When Morsi came to power, he stopped that pipeline, and in fact now there is this huge court case going on between Egypt and Israel, where Israel is claiming something of the order of 12 to 15 billion dollars, because having stopped the contract and not provided the gas, there was a clause that says you either give us the gas or you pay us. So at the same time now, there was the agreement to export from Israel to Egypt via the Leviathan pipe gas field, but now it's also under question whether or not Leviathan will be producing and when. So a very important player in the region is Egypt. And I'll come to my conclusions. I think energy politics are an empowerment if handled wisely and part of a wider strategy. It's clear that the discoverers need the long-term investments, and it's clear that you get most profit if you work with your neighbors. and that most investors to come, they need a stable political and legal framework. So in what I've been trying to describe is not only the political uncertainties in the region, but also the legal framework. Even in a country like Israel, where you had 2 years in order to decide whether or not they will export, then they sign all of these agreements. Now you have the antitrust authority putting them into question. All countries have a steep learning curve, and I think that applies for Cyprus, for Egypt, for Israel, for Turkey. All of those countries, their role in the energy sector is totally changing, and that will require time. And from the first few slides, I've also tried to indicate that the big powers are less interested in the region than what it was before. So if logic prevails, and if then there will be cooperation, there will be empowerment, and there will be profit from this. Thank you.
Well, thank you for a message of hope, if logic prevails. Well, thank you all three of our speakers for helping us up the steep learning curve.